Greetings everyone, welcome to another episode of Hard Talk HR. In today's episode we are talking about culture, change and dealing with complexity. Ever since the eruption of the COVID pandemic, organizations were required to drastically rethink how they work, how they operate, and it has certainly put tremendous pressure on the culture. So what is the right culture? How to build the right culture? How to lead and manage change? And how to deal with complexity in today's insanely changing and interconnected collaborative work became a priority and some of the biggest questions of organization and HR leaders are facing today. This is why I'm absolutely thrilled, delighted and happy to have Joan Lurie. Joan is the founder and CEO of Orgonomics, a boutique consultancy in Melbourne, Australia, and she brings over 20 years of practical experience on how to effectively deal with change and how to build the right culture in organizations. I hope you will enjoy today's episode, and if you do, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. At Hard Talk HR, we bring you fresh ideas and inspiring content from around the world of work. John, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's such a delight, such a privilege, especially since the eruption of the COVID pandemic. Organizations are facing massive challenges and certainly big questions around culture, around change and around how to deal with complexity. And let me start with a very interesting question about the organization dynamics and the subtlety of organization dynamic. Because when it comes to culture change or building the right culture, first of all, we must understand how organizations function in the first place. And you suggest that individual psychological technical analysts of organization can't really fully explain the subtlety of organization dynamics. So can you tell us why and what's the better way to understand how an organization functions?
I think it's such an important question for now because I think, Mihai, one of my theories about organizations is that the way we've understood them until now, the assumptions that leaders and practitioners have made are sort of in two dominant worldviews or two dominant lenses or paradigms. The one more technical, we see organizations more like machines, and we think the way to address them and fix them when there is symptomatic problems or even design them for good is through organizational charts, through good processes, through performance and reward systems and things like that. I think the other way we've understood them is through, they are like collections of people, and then that movement to we've got human resources we need to manage, and they have been seen as that's sort of a lever for change. And I think there's a third lens by which we can understand organizations, which is through the systemic lens, a more complexity lens, which says organizations, as much as they are collections of people, are actually a complex network of roles, relations, and the implicit and explicit contracts that get made between entities and between individuals, which often become invisible and implicit to organizations. And we tend to miss those because we're looking at organizations through the technical and the psychological and not through the systemic. And, systems are like gravity. Those relational dynamics, the implicit contracts, the mental maps that people run about role and how they contract role to role, those actually define behavior as much as who we are as people. And we assume that, what defines behavior in organizations is people's values, personality, styles. But actually, we could sort of hold a different set of assumptions that says what defines people's behavior is the system, the context they're in, and the roles that they get to occupy and contract with other parts of the organization for. And if you shift that to that lens, and you start to see and understand organizations through that lens, then you would do culture change quite differently. I might just give you a quick story which maybe brings that to life, because that's sort of quite a theoretical idea. I think if we think about an organization where the problem, they were underperforming, they were shrinking, they weren't meeting budget every month, The market was punishing them. And, the assumption that they'd made was that the CEOs that they'd hired were incapable, they weren't the right fit. And when I joined them, they were on to, their third CEO in 2.5 years. I mean, similarly, the assumption executives were making was that the problem was with their culture. People weren't accountable, people weren't collaborating. So it was a behavioral, cultural, personal attribution to what the problem was. But when we actually went in and diagnosed what was happening, what we discovered was that there was a merger a few years prior in this business. The merger had not happened. The two business entities had remained separate. They were actually competing. They hadn't come together to redraw the boundaries and integrate as an organization. And so the problem lay at the systemic level in terms of the interrelationship between those entities and the pattern that they got into. The problem wasn't that every individual person in the business was not accountable or not collaborating. So the problem wasn't behavioral. It was sitting at the systemic level and the implicit contract between the two entities to compete. And the shift that we had to make was to help those two entities integrate, redraw the boundaries of how the system functioned, and shift the roles and rules of engagement. And then suddenly, miraculously, they had a better culture, they were performing better, and you were in a completely different situation. But actually, we had changed nothing in terms of the values, the behaviors, and the individuals were the same.
And that's very interesting, especially it brings very nicely, connects to the next question, which is about dealing with change, and particularly when it comes to mergers and acquisitions, especially if it seems like on the surface two organizations is a perfect fit for a marriage, but at the end of the day we very often experience that such a merger potentially end up in a failure, or managing these cultures, it can be a very painful, very slow, very tedious process, and may or may not succeed. What are some of the concrete, typical mistakes, some concrete ideas you could share with us in terms of when it comes to dealing with change, and what better alternative do you offer?
Okay, I think there are a few things there. And I think the one is that leaders need to know what territory they're in. And what I mean by that is, very often if leaders are bringing this technical lens or the interpersonal lens, but actually their problem is not technical, it's more adaptive, or the problem is actually systemic, then they keep trying to change the wrong things and then wonder why, we don't get the results that we're looking for. So when you need to know is the problem more technical or more adaptive? I think Ron Harvitz's brilliant theory or framework that says we need to know which of those territories we're in, because you solve those problems quite differently. So the question leaders should always be asking themselves is, what is the nature of this challenge, the change? Is it a more technical or an adaptive change? And, you approach those quite differently. I think the other is what I see go wrong all the time is that people assume even if you're in the adaptive is more about the people. So we need to change what's going on interpersonally, engage people, convince them of the benefits to them, etc. But actually what they're not doing is addressing the role relations, the boundaries that are in between, the interactions between entities. So they're trying to solve systemic problems using interpersonal means by building trust and getting people to understand self and share stuff about themselves with each other. So often I think that's the other mistake, that people are trying to solve systemic problems that are sitting in the organization, like we've just described, using interpersonal psychological tools. And I'm not saying that there isn't a place for technical change or psychological change, but I think what goes wrong is because most leaders don't have a systemic lens, and often the consultants don't either, that they're trying to change personal things, technical things, and not systemic and adaptive ones. I think that, we've got to be really clear which territory we're in and not try and solve the one problem using the means of another. Okay. I think another thing that really is joined with that goes wrong is that leaders tend to set up the change leadership system, what I call the change leadership system, in a way which kind of builds resistance. So what do I mean by that? I think very often what I see happen in organizations is when there's large change to take place, organizations, leaders set up transformation teams, they set up heads of transformation, and they often gift the role of doing the transformation to these new subsystems or entities, and to the role of the head of transformation, who often does not have a line role or even a functional role in the business. And so that sets up a tension between the executive team who are running the business and the team or the transformation head who is charged with the transformation of the business or of a part of the business. And so I think one of the critical things that I'm always advising clients is be very aware that the change needs to be led by leaders, and that if you are going to set up a transformation team or have a role that is head of transformation, you've got to be really clear that it's their role to support the leaders to enable the change, but not to actually change the business. Because what you do then is you set up an inverted role dynamic, which actually sets up a resistance into the system. And I see this go wrong all the time. And leaders then call me in and say, we've been going with this change for over a year. We don't understand why we're not getting the traction. And it's because you've sort of set up this push me, pull you setup in the change leadership system. So one of the really critical things for leaders to be conscious of is how they are setting up that subsystem of change leadership, what roles they are giving different parts of the system, and being very systemic in that design. I think the final thing I would say is that, often what I see is that leaders don't do the work up front to really diagnose and understand what is going on in the system in relation to the challenge. So they start with a solution, they create a team, a project team or a transformation team that beaver away, kind of going at the detail, and then they roll the solution out into the system in some kind of linear way, and they assume that all change is programmatic and linear, when in fact adaptive change or systemic change is much more iterative. And what leaders should be doing is starting with understanding where the system is, doing discovery and diagnostic, and designing their way as they go in a much more iterative sense. So what's the next adjacent possibility? What's the next thing that we can shift in the system? How do we change adaptively rather than this programmatic linear change? And the distinction I talk about is, one is first order change, you drop solutions into the system, and another is second order change, where you actually shift how the system is working, the dynamics in the system. And we've got to be really clear which of those territories we're in as well.
Very interesting. You haven't used the magic word, which is agile. Everything is agile these days, but what you say about adaptive change, it's really how we approach change through an agile lens, isn't it?
Yeah, I think what you're raising is so critical, Mihai, because I think this is a great example of agile methodologies being a kind of technical solution, that you put into the system. And then you think that by putting agile into the system, the methodology, scrums and sprints and all of that, which are very helpful in one domain, if you put that into the system, then the system will become more agile. But actually what you could think about is build agility into the system. So enable the system to continuously observe itself, understand where its growth edges are, develop an understanding and coherence around where the incoherences are, and create space and context for them to continuously work on themselves as a system. So you can create the adaptive capacity into the DNA and culture of the organization through those kinds of rituals without actually putting in a formal agile methodology and approach. The second one is a more second order change. The first one is often a first order change, because you put the agile methodology in, but you actually don't change the system.
Very interesting. Let me just come back to the first part of your answers about who owns the change, because what I heard is that very often change management and the ownership of change is left to transformation leaders, and even for consultants like yourself. And if that's the expectation, when a consultant leaves, then everything easily falls back to the old bad habits. So what's the What's the best way to transform this knowledge and transform the ownership, and particularly when it comes to the role of HR leaders in this equation? What would you suggest?
I think that what I would suggest is that in every instance, you've got to be really clear around that leaders need to, own the change, and that how consultants should help leaders, how HR should help leaders, is to provide the scaffold, the infrastructure to enable leaders to do change in a more adaptive way if that's what's required, so that you give leaders the tools and the scaffold and the infrastructure, and you help them create the conditions in the organization for this adaptation to happen. But you don't take that off the leader's shoulders, so to speak, or take it out of their role and create some separate entity or subsystem or individual who has the role to do the change. And I think that, that is absolutely critical for consultants to be able to know how ecosystems work, how systemic relations work, and help leaders actually design the system for success and understand their own role in it and take up their own role, rather than give that role over to another part of the system or to an outsider. And I think that really is one of the fundamental things that goes wrong with change, is that leaders hand the change accountability, the design, the solutions over to another part of the business, or even to an external. And by the way, Mihai, I think that a lot of consultants are complicit with that, because they come in and they say, sure, we'll take the role of being the experts, telling you what's wrong, and we'll give you the solution, right? Rather than actually creating the challenge role to the assumptions leaders might be holding, and helping leaders step into the role of sort of self-disruption, so to speak, right? And I think that's a really big systemic repatterning that we need in the field for how consultants take up their role to assist executives.
Very often I believe it's not the lack of will when it comes to dealing with change, from the owning the change from the executive's point of view. It's more about lack of time, lack of resources. Executives are overwhelmed, under-resourced in many cases. They just simply can't squeeze one more thing on their already very busy plate. What would you suggest? What can we do about it?
Well, I think this is where often our solutions become our problems, right? Because if we hold a hypothesis or an assumption that my role is to run the business, not to change it, and I can give that change over to someone else because it's my role to run it and my plate's already full, then you're creating a solution which actually becomes your problem, because you can't give that over to someone else. It is the role of executives to change the organization. So it's both to run the business and work on the system simultaneously. And I think what we're facing in the change industry and in consulting, more broadly, is that there are a lot of implicit assumptions around what does good change look like? Change champions, transformation teams, projects, and scoping and all that sort of thing. And I think what we're really wanting to do is reframe and challenge some of those implicit assumptions about change, because those change methodologies are maybe fit for more linear, obvious kinds of change, but they're really no longer fit for complex adaptive change. And yet we try and use those same solutions and sort of drop them into other change contexts. And I think we have to be able to hold multiple kind of ideas around what change are we doing, what territory are we in, and what's the applicable roles and structure, infrastructure that we need to create for those different territories. We can't solve all change one way, but I think implicitly it's sort of become that's what good change management is. We have to disrupt our field.
Absolutely, that's brilliant. I think we're kind of missing the evolution, that just like everything around us evolves, the way we deal with change requires a new lens. We look at change through. And let's bring us to the very next question, which is about managing and dealing with complexity in today's insanely fast-changing, interconnected and collaborative world, dealing with complexity is a priority for business leaders and organization leaders, and very often kind of a quick solution to dealing with complexity was, let's break down silos, let's flatten the organization. Breaking down silos makes everything much more transparent, much faster, and probably more successful when it comes to collaboration. But you suggest that breaking down silos just simply will not work. So what are some of the ideas you have, and what are the best solutions when it comes to dealing with complexity?
Okay, yeah, this is a very big question. And I think, one of the things that I love what you're saying, because I hear that all the time. The problem is that we're in silos, we've got to break them down. And when I often ask leaders, well, if you weren't operating in silos and you were to break that down, can you describe to me what that would look like? And very often, Mihai, the response I get, the description I get is behavioral. We would be listening more. We would be inviting people to meetings. We would include people more. And people can kind of spit out those behavioral solutions. But I think when you are looking at complexity and having to get better collaboration, really you want a systemic response, not just a behavioral response. Because you can change behaviors at a sort of first order level, but actually what you want to change is the interrelationship between, and not at a behavioral level, but in terms of what is each part of the system designed to do? What is the function or the role of each subsystem in this complex ecosystem that is the organization? And what are the role relations or the patterns of engagement that should be between the entities? And that is a very different description, and it's a very different way of coming at, finding a way out of the entanglement or out of the silos. I think a lot of people assume that in order to collaborate better, breaking down silos means dropping the boundaries. And I think that you are as much risk if you take away boundary completely in order to get collaboration, which is often what people's solutions are, than if you actually have very rigid boundary. What you actually want to do is define where the boundaries are and build coherence around that in the system, and then set up enough fluidity, I would say, in the boundaries that you can shift those boundaries when you need to, but not take them away. Taking away boundaries and collapsing silos, what you often get is mush and porridge, and you are as probably in more risk if you're in the porridge and no one knows really what their role is, where their role begins and ends, where the boundaries of role are, either at an individual level or at a subsystem level. And I often see that if you are in kind of entangled porridge or mush, I call it, then the presenting symptom of that is very often interpersonal conflict. And people then accuse each other of being bullies, of not understanding each other, of not being supportive. But actually, if you go into underlying what the problem is, there is incoherence in how people are defining in their minds where the boundaries are of their role and what the role relations and rules of engagement should be, either between their individual roles or between subsystem roles. Like, what is the role of HR? What is the role of line? And is there coherence there in terms of how they interact? And often the gold of collaboration is found in the in-between. It's found in the interactions between entities and between roles, which is a very core idea to complexity, that it is not sitting in a reductionist way in the part. And if you fix the part and give clarity to the part, or create a boundary there, that's where you're going to get coherence and flow. It's in the clarity of the interrelationship between that you'll get coherence and flow emerging. And actually, that's where collaboration emerges from. Okay, from that interaction, not from breaking down silos.
Brilliant, I understand it. So what would you suggest? What's the role of HR in setting those boundaries, and how would HR collaborate with the other parts of the business? Of course, they are also just as much integral parts of the business than anyone else. But how would you suggest them to take their leadership role in setting those boundaries and managing this complexity?
Well, I think one of the ideas that I'm playing with is that, what we've got is HR very focused traditionally on people. And of course, that's a critical domain, that's their core expertise. But actually, another core expertise and capacity that we need to help HR practitioners build is this idea of how do organizations as complex ecosystems work? And how can they take up their role to be what I would call more organizational ecologists, where they're helping organizations, including themselves, see themselves as a complex system and see the role that they're playing in that complex system. I think one of the things that I see often go wrong at the moment is that when leaders are asked to diagnose what a problem is, or even HR, they diagnose it as if they are not part of it, as if they're not part of the complex system, and they look at the system outwardly as object. But what they really want to help themselves do and other leaders in the organization is see how they're operating or functioning as a complex system. So learn how to discover that, how to make those complex role relational dynamics visible, understand where the incoherences are, because often that is where the lack of collaboration is, where the conflict is, where the noise or the underperformance is. So I would say that HR practitioners need to start to build their systemic lens and build their muscle for complexity and for discovering how systems work and for creating space in organizations for that discovery to happen.
That's a brilliant notion that organization leaders need to become ecologists into looking at the organization through a complex lens, and of course looking at the future as how the organization is part of an entire ecosystem. Joan, Lurie, thank you so much for being on the show today. If people would like to reach out to you to continue the discussion, explore a bit further, what's the best way to reach you?
On my website, there's a way to be in touch. Reach out to me and connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm often posting articles and more stuff about this. And of course, Mihai, I'm going to be talking at the HR Congress. I love being a part of that. I'm very excited to be speaking again this year. And I think we will pick up this theme at the Congress again around how can HR practitioners build this ecosystemic lens and be able to support leaders and explore this idea of organizational ecology and how we can bring this more to our field. So I hope people can join us at the Congress for that as well.
So really looking forward to that as well.
Thank you so much, Mihai.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.